The stage is, of course, set in Germany for the 48th G7 meeting. World leaders have started arriving at the venue. Like most high-stakes summits, the Ukraine-Russia war will dominate the talks at the G7 as well. Now, the Indian Prime Minister, of course, landed early this morning in Munich, roughly at about 5:30 p.m. local time there. The Indian Prime Minister landed at the airport. And this, of course, is his second trip to Germany in a span of just 2 months. In the month of May, he had visited for the 6th edition of the India-Germany Intergovernmental Consultations and is also expected to hold bilateral meetings with other G7 leaders as well. And the American President Joe Biden also reached the host nation. He was greeted with a red carpet welcome, and he is on a 5-day trip of Europe. Joe Biden will first attend the meeting of the Group of 7 nations. This, of course, is the grouping of the 7 richest nations in the world, where he's expected to lead the economic powers in the Bavarian Alps. And later, he's set to travel to Madrid for a summit with the leaders of the 30 NATO nations. The French President Emmanuel Macron has also reached the venue. Accompanying him is, of course, the First Lady of France. The G7 consists of 7 leading economies of the world, namely Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States. Now, Germany took over the presidency just this year, and there are some other issues that will, of course, come up for discussion. These, of course, include energy security, which is so crucial for the European nations during this time of the war in Ukraine. Now, issues such as climate change, COVID-19 pandemic and food security will also be on top of the agenda. For several years, G7 has attracted protesters to its venue, and this year is no different. More than 1,500 people gathered to criticize their governments, for their inaction against climate change. This is an issue that is going to be very widely discussed at the summit. And people also wore the face masks of these leaders of the G7 nations, stating that these leaders have not done enough in combating climate change and in addressing other issues such as clean energy and food insecurity. Now remember, these are issues that are going to be very prominently discussed, especially in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war. The issue of energy security and clean energy is likely to dominate the talks. Climate activists had hoped that the war will be a silver lining for the environment. You see, at international stages like the COP26, these rich G7 nations make some very tall claims of lowering emissions and adopting cleaner and greener and renewable energy technologies. So now, when an unusual opportunity came up, the activists were optimistic that these countries, these are the richest countries in the world, will cut their dependence on fossil fuels. But the exact opposite of that is happening. Deprived of Russian gas, because they have to move away from the Russian gas and other Russian hydrocarbons, these nations are now relying on coal to generate their electricity. Now, rich countries are making a dash for fossil fuels, so as Russia continues to burn its own natural resources, the Western nations are also investing elsewhere in new coal, in new oil and in new gas. They're either resurrecting the old mines at home or are approaching smaller nations to burn fossil fuel on their behalf. The Group of 7 nations will, of course, this event is expected to start in a couple of hours from now, and we'll be getting you all the updates as they unfold in Munich. This, remember, is, of course, a crucial G7 summit that will take place today. Now, the country that's been invited, India, is not a member of the G7 nations. India is not a part of this grouping of 7 richest nations in the world, but India has been invited. Germany invited its close Asian ally. Washington has said that New Delhi's presence at the table is crucial because the agenda of the G7 summit this time around is going to be very deep and very diverse. And this comes on the heels of the West and India's differing stance on this Russian war on Ukraine. The United States and Europe have chosen to go the sanctions way, but India instead has chosen diplomacy. So the question, of course, is, will New Delhi's cameo in Germany affect its relations with Moscow? Now, the G7 leaders say that the aim is not to splinter the two allies. India has, of course, made it abundantly clear that even after the G7 meeting, New Delhi will continue to purchase crude oil from Russia. And that, of course, is something that India has been insisting upon for a long time. There are simmering tensions with the West. The Foreign Secretary has said that India's regular participation in the summit is an indication of acceptance. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of what is unfolding in Munich and what is expected to happen today as the G7 nations, of course, come together to discuss several issues. We're joined in by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant, who's joining us live from Munich at this point of time. Siddhant, this is a crucial day where the leaders of the G7 nations are in Germany and they are going to be discussing a whole host of different issues. The Russian war in Ukraine will dominate the agenda, and also the crucial nitty-gritties of the purchase of Russian hydrocarbons. What do we expect?
Well, Mohammed, it's just around 6:30 a.m. Munich time, and it's a long day. The Indian Prime Minister has arrived. So two key focus areas today. First, of course, the G7 summit begins later today at around 3 p.m. Indian Standard Time, and we will see the leaders taking part in 3 sessions, one of which is foreign policy and security. And naturally, one of the key issues will be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the impact on the food and the commodity prices, and what G7 can do in terms of dealing with this worry. But also remember, the Indian Prime Minister will be having meetings with the foreign leaders, and today he will be devoting his day to the diaspora. In fact, I'm just standing near his hotel, and we saw earlier today the visuals of how meeting the Indian diaspora in his usual manner during his foreign visits abroad. So it's a packed day in terms of diplomacy, but in terms of the people-to-people relationship between India and Germany, this is the second visit of the Indian Prime Minister to Germany in a matter of 2 months. He was in Berlin last month. That was a bilateral visit, but this time the focus is multilateral, the focus being on the G7, how India can provide a solution to the world in terms of contemporary problems from climate change to commodity prices.
Absolutely indeed, Siddhant. We, of course, see what is unfolding there. And this, of course, is a very crucial meeting that the Indian Prime Minister will, of course, have. And we also, a little while back, saw the visuals of the Indian Prime Minister, who, in fact, arrived in Munich a little while back, and he was immediately mobbed by the members of the Indian diaspora. This, of course, is the charisma of the Indian Prime Minister. No matter where he goes, that is the kind of support that he enjoys. Now, Siddhant, I also want you to discuss a bit in terms, in terms of the nitty-gritties, the details and the finer aspects of the Indian Prime Minister's visit there. Now, the Russian war in Ukraine has, of course, divided the world. India has chosen the path of diplomacy. The Western nations and Europe are trying to woo India onto their side, but India has been very principled in its stand. India has continued to purchase oil from Russia because that suits India's interest, but at the same time, India wants to, in many ways, give a new direction to the world in terms of how the world should be approaching this crisis in Ukraine. What do we expect is likely to be discussed on the front of India, which has insisted on purchasing oil from Russia?
Well, we have seen criticism, the Western media reports of how India is importing energy from Russia. But remember, India has made it clear that foreign policy is for the betterment of people, and India is in fact using this policy so that it can get cheap crude oil. That helps the Indians the most, who of course have been impacted by inflation like any other country in the world because of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. So now the key focus will be on trying to find the solution to the problem that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because that essentially is at the heart of the problems like inflation, like impact of the high prices of food, commodity, fuel and supply chain disruption. So what India will be doing? India will be reiterating its stance which India has talked about in the past, that how both sides should work together and sit down on table to have a conversation. And we know that India has condemned the Busha incident in the past, but largely if you look at India's strategic position, India is strategically moving to the west but engaging with Moscow as well. In fact, just 2 days ago we saw the BRICS virtual summit where the Indian Prime Minister was participating, and he talked about the people-to-people linkages, and BRICS is an important platform in terms of developing countries. Large countries like India and China are part of the grouping, but also India is being invited to various groupings like the G7. Now, this is the third time the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is participating in the G7 summit, and he will be using this opportunity to talk about how India is ready to be a solution provider from climate change to other issues, and that remains the key focus. In fact, two sessions the Indian Prime Minister will be addressing on Monday on G7. That will be the G7 outreach summit that's going to take place, and India has been invited along with South Africa, Senegal, Argentina and Indonesia. So the G7 reaching out to the global south at a time when G7 needs more countries to stand with it, and the focus of the German Chancellor will be that how democratic countries can work together to send a message to Moscow. It's given that India will not be part of any statement which criticizes Moscow, but India will be part of issues like energy, climate change when they are discussed at the G7.
Absolutely, indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Siddhant, for joining us and getting us all those details there. It's going to be a very busy day ahead. We'll of course come back to you as more details emerge from Munich. But for the time being though, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Munich there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.